Friday, January 22nd, 1937. Congratulations to Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer on the arrival of a son at their home. Mrs. Meyer was formerly Miss Ruby Idy. Friday, June 9th, 1939. The headline is 275 graduate from rural schools. Ironton, Wheelerburg, Bertha S. Idy, Chester E. Idy, Margaret I. Kepi, Hazel H. Mucko, Harold E. Rickert, and Billy L. Schluter. December 2nd, 1941. Friday evening, Mrs. Albert Idy and daughter Bertha attended the class play at Lime Ridge. Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy announced the approaching marriage of their daughter Eileen to Byron Shannon, son of Mr. and Mrs. William Shannon of Richland Center. Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy accompanied Mrs. Alma Voigt and Albert Ludum of Reedsburg to Beloit Thursday, where they visited the Otto Voigt home. Miss Dorothy Rickert spent a week ago Saturday and Sunday with Mr. and Mrs. Donald Idy and family. Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy and family were Thanksgiving Day guests of Mrs. Idy's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Clark Smith, who live east of Reedsburg. March 10th, 1942. Mr. and Mrs. Byron Shannon spent Sunday with the latter's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy. Miss Dorothy Rickert is staying with Mr. and Mrs. Donald Idy so that she may complete her sophomore year at Lime Ridge High School. Her parents have moved to a farm in Winfield. Mr. and Mrs. Carl Kaler were Sunday evening callers at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence Meyer. March 31st, 1942. Several from this community spent Wednesday evening with Mr. and Mrs. Byron Shannon at Little Willow. The occasion was the celebration of Mrs. Shannon's, formerly Eileen Idy's, 21st birthday. Those present were Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy, Bertha and Chester, Mr. and Mrs. Glenn Pickle and Sons, Wayne and Melvin, Mr. and Mrs. Carl Kaler and children, Charlotte, Billy, Nettie, and Nola, Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer and sons, Jimmy and Jerry, and Mr. and Mrs. Henry Meyer. Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy and family entertained a group of relatives Sunday in honor of Mr. Idy's birthday anniversary. Mr. and Mrs. Henry Meyer and family were callers at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Ed Von Barron Sunday evening. Thursday, January 7th, 1943. An infant dies. Janice Eileen, infant daughter of Private and Mrs. Byron Shannon, died at the municipal hospital Monday. She lived only 12 hours after birth. Private Shannon is stationed in California, and Mrs. Shannon has been making her home here. Thursday, January 25th, 1945. Births. A son to Mr. and Mrs. Byron Shannon, Route 3, Reedsburg, on January 20th. January 26, 1948. Russell Shannon celebrated his third birthday, January 20th, with a birthday party that evening. Mrs. Albert Idy and son Chester accompanied Mr. and Mrs. Donald Idy to Reedsburg Monday. Donald Idy spent 3 days in the hospital after getting hurt when a limb fell on his head. He had several stitches taken to close the wound. The stitches were removed on Wednesday. Visitors at Albert Idy's January 18th were Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer and family, Mr. and Mrs. Emil Idy of Reedsburg, Mr. and Mrs. Donald Elwood, and Judy, Mr. and Mrs. McBride of Baraboo.
March 8th, 1948. Mrs. Albert Idy spent a night last week with her aunt, Mrs. John Endy of Reedsburg, who was ill. Donald Idy is unable to work due to rheumatism. He is taking treatments in Reedsburg at the chiropractors. Those who went to Baraboo on Sunday to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Donald Elwood to help Donald celebrate his birthday were Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy and son Chester, Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer and two sons, Mr. and Mrs. Emil Idy and Mrs. Eileen Shannon and two sons of Reedsburg. March 29, 1948. Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy had company from Baraboo Wednesday evening. Those who spent Easter at the Albert Idy home and helped Albert Idy and his daughter Eileen celebrate their birthdays were Mr. and Mrs. Donald Idy and daughter, Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer and family, Mr. and Mrs. Donald Elwood and daughter of Baraboo, Mr. and Mrs. Emil Idy of Reedsburg. April 5th, 1948. Chester Idy had an operation for appendicitis at the St. Mary's Ringling Hospital in Baraboo on Thursday. He is getting along nicely. His mother, Mrs. Albert Idy, was a guest at the home of her daughter Bertha and family from Thursday till Friday afternoon. Mrs. Eileen Shannon and Sons of Reedsburg are spending a few days with her parents. Mrs. Donald Idy received the sad news Friday of the sudden death of her 4-year-old nephew, Glenn Thompson, who was ill only a short time. He is the son of Mr. and Mrs. Leonard Thompson, who live near Bloom City. Those who visited Chester Idy Sunday afternoon at the Baraboo Hospital were his mother, Mrs. Albert Idy, Donald Idy, and daughter Donna Jean, Wayne Pickle, Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer, and sons. Mrs. Donald Idy went with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Otto Rickert of Winfield, to the Leonard Thompson home Sunday afternoon at the Walter Burmester home. April 12th, 1948. Chester Idy was able to leave the Baraboo Hospital Tuesday and stayed with his sister, Mrs. Donald Elwood and family of that city until Saturday evening when he returned home. Albert Idy was seriously ill Monday morning and a doctor was called. He is better at this writing. Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer and Sons spent Monday evening at Albert Idy's. April 22nd, 1948. Wednesday, Mrs. Albert Idy accompanied her aunt, Mrs. John Endy of Reedsburg, to visit relatives at Lone Rock. Mrs. Eveline Grover, Mrs. Harris Thorne, and Mrs. Royce Kinser also went with Endy. Mrs. Albert Idy's brother, Donald Smith, and wife from California arrived Saturday at the Albert Idy home and will spend several weeks visiting relatives in this community and near Reedsburg. May 3rd, 1948. Those who spent Sunday at Albert Idy's were Mr. and Mrs. Donald Idy and Donna Jean, and Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer and family, local, Mr. and Mrs. Donald Elwood and daughter, Judy, and Donald's father of Baraboo, Mrs. Royce Kinser and 2 daughters of Reedsburg, and Mr. and Mrs. Donald Smith of San Bernardino, California. Mrs. Donald Smith is working at the woolen mill in Reedsburg. May 17, 1948. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Elwood and daughter Judy of Baraboo spend from Friday night until Sunday at Albert Idy's. The following relatives enjoyed a party at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer and family Sunday evening. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Elwood and daughter of Baraboo, Mr. and Mrs. Emil Idy and Clark Smith of Reedsburg, Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy and son Chester, Mr. and Mrs. Donald Idy and daughter, and Mr. and Mrs. Donald Smith. May 24th, 1948. Mrs. Emil Idy of Reedsburg entertained a group of ladies at her home Saturday evening at a pink and blue shower for Mrs. Clarence Meyer. July 6, 1948. Almost everyone from this community attended some part of the 3-day centennial celebration in Reedsburg, and all report a good time. A group of relatives enjoyed a picnic dinner at the Clarence Meyer home July 4th. Although it had been ideal weather to make hay, everyone is wishing for a good rain and a little cooler weather. Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer named their baby boy Dale Evan.
July 19th, 1948. Mrs. Byron Shannon and Sons of Reedsburg are spending a few days at the home of her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer entertained a group of relatives at their home Sunday when their baby was christened. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Idy and daughter Donna Jean, Chester Idy, Wayne, and Melvin Pickle spent Sunday at Devil's Lake. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Smith, who have spent the summer with his sister, Mrs. Albert Idy, and family with other relatives, plan on starting for their home in California this weekend. Donald Smith's sister, Mrs. Royce Kinser, and 2 daughters of Reedsburg are also going to California at the same time and expect to make their home there. Judy Elwood is spending this week with her grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy, while her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Donald Elwood of Baraboo, are vacationing in northern Wisconsin. July 26, 1948. Mrs. Albert Idy spent Tuesday with her sister, Mrs. Winifred Kinser, near Reedsburg. The Albert Idy family entertained a group of relatives Friday evening at a farewell party for Mr. and Mrs. Donald Smith and Mrs. Winifred Kinzer and two daughters who left Monday morning for home in San Bernardino, California. September 6, 1948. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Elwood and daughter of Baraboo spent the weekend holidays with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy. Mr. and Mrs. Byron Shannon and Sons of Reedsburg were Sunday evening visitors there. September 20th, 1948. The young folks of this community have been enjoying swimming in the pool at the Donald Idy farm that he and some of his relatives and friends helped make with tractors, etc. By the sudden change in temperature, it seems that the swimming season is over for the year. The Wheelerburg Homemakers Club met at the home of Mrs. Albert Idy Tuesday, September 21st. The corn canning season ended for the Reedsburg Foods Corporation Thursday, September 23rd. Mrs. Ted Hinsey, Mrs. Glenn Pickle, Cecilia Rippon, and Mrs. Donald Idy from this community were employed there. Mr. and Mrs. Byron Shannon and Sons were visitors at the Albert Idy home one day recently. Byron returned to his work at Kenosha, and his wife and sons spent the weekend with her parents. Other visitors there Sunday were Mr. and Mrs. Don Elwood and Judy Baraboo, Mr. and Mrs. Emil Idy, Reedsburg, Mr. and Mrs. Donald Idy and Donna Jean, Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer and family. November 22nd, 1948. Albert Idy was quite ill the first of last week, but is much better now. Mrs. Byron Shannon and Sons of Reedsburg are spending several days at the home of her parents to help with the work while her brother Chester is deer hunting. We wish the deer hunters good luck. Donald Idy, Chester Idy, and Chris Miller were three who went from here, but there are others from nearby. December 6, 1948. Mrs. Albert Idy and Mrs. Donald Idy accompanied Mrs. Emil Idy of Reedsburg to Madison on Friday to do some shopping. Mr. and Mrs. Chris Muller and family entertained at a party at their home for the group of deer hunters and their families Thursday evening. Those who attended were Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy and Chester, Mr. and Mrs. Donald Idy and daughter, local, and Mr. and Mrs. Art Haas of Reedsburg. January 10th, 1949. Mr. and Mrs. Otto Rickert and son Melvin of Winfield and Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy were Thursday night visitors at the Donald Idy home. Sunday evening, the Albert Idy family and Donald Idy's were at Clarence Meyer's, where they all celebrated the birthday of Jerry Meyer and Donna Jean Idy. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Idy and daughter and Mrs. Albert Idy spent Sunday at the Donald Elwood home at Rock Springs.
March 14, 1949. Mrs. Albert Idy and Mrs. Donald Idy attended the double funeral services in Baraboo Friday for veterans Harry and Charles Elwood. They were brothers of Donald Elwood of Rock Springs, whose wife was the former Bertha Idy. Donald Smith of California arrived Sunday afternoon at the home of his sister, Mrs. Albert Idy and family. Mrs. Byron Shannon and Sons of Reedsburg spent the weekend at the Albert Idy home. April 11, 1949. Donna Jean Idy is absent from school with the chickenpox. April 26, 1949. Sunday visitors at Albert Idy's were Mr. and Mrs. Donald Elwood and daughter of Rock Springs, and Mr. and Mrs. Emil Idy, Mr. and Mrs. Byron Shannon and Sons, Reedsburg, Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer and Sons, and Donald Idy and daughter. Mrs. Donald Idy spent a few days in Illinois and attended the funeral of her aunt who passed away suddenly. May 30th, 1949. Mrs. Albert Idy and father, Clark Smith, Mrs. Harris Thorne and daughter, Mrs. Richard Kelly of Reedsburg spent Thursday afternoon at Aubrey. Friday afternoon, the following people attended a surprise birthday party for Mrs. Albert Idy at her home. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Elwood and daughter, Rock Springs, Mrs. Byron Shannon and two sons, Reedsburg, Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer and three sons, Mrs. Donald Idy and daughter, Mr. and Mrs. Glenn Pickle and two sons, Isaac Silvers and daughter, Mr. and Mrs. Fred Spike and four children, Mr. and Mrs. Carl Kaler, Mr. and Mrs. Evan Wheeler and two children, Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence Meyer and three children. Those who were unable to attend were Donald Idy and Donald Smith, who were employed in Minnesota putting up hay mowers, and the Chris Mueller family and Oscar Griffins and Elgin Canans. 5 tables of 500 were played, with honors going to Clarence Meyer, Mrs. Carl Kaler, Wayne Pickle, and Mrs. Donald Elwood. After lunch was served, everyone departed for home at a late hour, wishing Mrs. Idy many more happy birthdays. July 18th, 1949. Donald Idy is enjoying a new pickup truck he purchased lately. If weather permits, threshing in this neighborhood will start Wednesday, July 20th. Mr. and Mrs. Donald Elwood and daughter of Rock Springs and Mr. and Mrs. Jean Elwood of Beloit were Sunday visitors at the Albert Idy home. October 3rd, 1949. Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy and Mr. and Mrs. Emil Idy returned home Friday evening from their trip to South Dakota. January 2nd, 1950. New Year's visitors at the Albert Idy home were Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Meyer and family, Mr. and Mrs. Donald Idy and Donna Jean, Mrs. Byron Shannon, and 2 boys. Monday dinner guests in the Emil Idy home in Reedsburg were Mr. and Mrs. Albert Idy and Chester and the Clarence Meyer family. Thursday, August 30th, 1951. A daughter is born. Mrs. Albert Idy spent several days with her daughter, Mrs. Don Elwood, and family at Rock Springs. A daughter, Janet Lynn, was born to Mr. and Mrs. Don Elwood August 19th at the St. Mary's Ringling Hospital at Baraboo.
We share a special family. Our addresses are the same. We share morning over coffee, and we even share a name. We share many joys and sorrows, special friends that we have known. But we're two very different people, but we are one in flesh and bone. For we are partners in emotion as the years go by. And whatever makes you sad brings tears to my eyes. I can't always make you happy, but I'm happy when I try. For we are partners in emotion, you and I. We love the flowers in the springtime. We love the colors in the fall. We love walking by the ocean or holding hands in the mall. We love church on Sunday morning, amazing grace, never alone. We love to bow our heads together, and we still love that old love song. For we are partners in emotion as the years go on. And whatever makes you sad brings tears to my eyes. I can't always make you happy, But I'm happy with our choice, for we are partners in emotion, you and I. Yes, we're partners